This morning I'm going to talk about John Dube and Nelson Mandela, two African National Congress presidents and a 20th century journey from accommodation to reconciliation. The talk will have three sections plus the conclusion. The first section starts with three quotations and the underlying theme for the talk. The second compares and contrasts the lives of the two men. And the third focuses on the journey from accommodation to reconciliation. Now let me start with the three quotations. The first is from Nelson Mandela at John L. Dube's grave after Mandela had cast his vote in the 1994 presidential election. I am here before you, Mr. President, to report to you that South Africa is free, and now may your soul rest in peace. The second quotation is from Dube's 1912 acceptance of the African National Congress presidency. You have asked me to lead. I take for my motto, Festina Lente, hasten slowly, and for my patron saint, I select the great and edifying man, Booker Washington. We, the natives of South Africa, must be up and doing, but I recognize too the necessity of moving cautiously and making progress prudently, and Booker Washington is to be my guiding star. Firstly, because he is perhaps the most famous and best living example of our Africa's sons, and secondly, because like him, I too have my heart centered mainly in the education of my race. The third quotation comes from Barack Obama speaking at the memorial service for Nelson Mandela in 2013. The questions we face today, Obama said, how to promote equality and justice, how to uphold freedom and human rights, how to end conflict and sectarian war, do not have easy answers. But there were no easy answers in front of Nelson Mandela, who reminds us that it always seems impossible until it is done. South Africa shows that we can change, that we can choose a world defined not by our differences, but by our common hopes. We can choose a world defined not by conflict, but by peace and justice and opportunity. Now these three quotations fit this talk theme of accommodation and reconciliation in a couple of ways that are interwoven throughout. The first way is that the 20th century journey from accommodation to reconciliation that culminated with Mandela's election as South Africa's president had its origins, as Mandela recognized in 1994 with John Dube and his approach of accommodation, conciliation, and deference to white political authority. As Mandela said in his autobiography, I voted at Oaklange High School, for it was there that John Dube, the first president of the ANC, was buried. Casting my vote near his gravesite brought history full circle, for the mission he began 82 years before was about to be achieved. The second way is that of the significant yet changing nature of the relationship and interaction among Africans in South Africa and African Americans. This took place over the course of the 20th century. As one historian has noted, there's a remarkable congruence between the struggle of a racial minority for equal rights in the United States and of a majority for its rightful share of power in South Africa. But it was more than a congruence. It was a two-way transatlantic traffic of peoples, institutions, and ideologies. In discussing this journey from accommodation to reconciliation, I'll be looking at the ambiguities within which Dube operated. His was a position of weakness at a time of white colonial power and dominance. Mandela's early career took place in a similar context, but over his lifetime, the context in which he lived changed to the point where apartheid had collapsed and political power moved into African hands. Whereas in the early part of the 20th century, Dube, as was the case with his guiding star, Booker T. Washington, had to accommodate to white political and socioeconomic power. Mandela in the 1990s, as president of South Africa, needed to address the issue of reconciliation. It was now white South Africa's turn to accommodate to black political power. Yet even today, as this distribution income shows, political power and socioeconomic power are not equated in South Africa because white socioeconomic power continues to a great degree. There is thus an ambiguity still within today's South Africa, African political power, alongside considerable white economic and socioeconomic and sociocultural power. Now, I would like then to comment just a little bit that the dreams of liberation have not been fully achieved then in South Africa, although less so certainly in the United States for African Americans, because they still have heavy burdens. Now, regarding the significance of the U.S.-South African ties, it is necessary to reflect on how these ties have influenced the course of events in both countries. And in this connection, one finds a reversal of the flow and influence and inspiration over time. In the early 20th century, it was Dube and his fellow educated middle-class Africans who looked to Washington and other Americans for inspiration. To them, Washington, as Saul Pleitke on the screen shows, was the greatest black man of our time. Now, for Nelson Mandela, by the end of the 20th century, he was the greatest black man of the time, and even perhaps the greatest man of the time. The first black American president in 2013 called him the last great liberator of the 20th century and placed him in the company of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, and America's founding fathers. President Mandela was echoing the response of African Americans to Nelson Mandela's first trip to the United States some 4 months after he got out of prison. He was an African hero to many black Americans, embodying American dreams, and who belonged in the pantheon of African American heroes. In return, Mandela was very conscious of the contribution of black Americans over time to the struggle, and he very consciously acknowledged that. And interestingly, when he met Rosa Parks for the first time, he said, "Rosa, Rosa, Rosa Parks," ignoring the surrounding dignitaries. So Mandela was very aware of African American life and the African American struggle. Now, I would like to turn to the two men, Nelson Mandela and John Dube, the times within which they lived, by comparing and contrasting the two lives. Let me start again with another American president, Bill Clinton, addressing a joint session of the South African Parliament, invoking the words inscribed on Dube's tombstone in his salute to President Mandela. "Mr. President," Bill Clinton said, "for millions upon millions of Americans, South Africa's story is embodied by your heroic sacrifice and your breathtaking walk out of the darkness and into the glorious light, representing now, as they do, the opposite ends of the long journey from accommodation to reconciliation. Dube and Mandela provide a means for understanding the vastly different context in which Africans waged their protracted political struggle to secure their rightful place in their own country. John Dube was unable to walk out of the political darkness and into the glorious political light. In his lifetime, such imagery could only apply to the passage from the darkness of life on earth to the glorious light of heaven. Nelson Mandela, however, was able to experience this transition in his own lifetime. The first time was when in February 1990, he emerged from the darkness of 27 long years in prison to the glorious light of freedom, and then again with his inauguration as President of South Africa on May 10, 1994, which symbolized the end of the darkness of the apartheid era and the glorious light of the new South Africa. With this fundamental difference in mind, let's consider the lives of these two presidents, lives that had parallels as well as significant differences due in great part to both their times and their circumstances.